Hi guys, I just wanted to give you a little intro before we get started on this one. Just so because there's a few things I want to say about the plugins and just about the whole setup pretty much. This one went a little longer than I'd like because I took it to a full composition. And the reason I did that is because it's rendered out in separate scenes and I wasn't sure which direction I wanted to play this originally, so I rendered it out in separate scenes, and then I worried about which direction to play the animation in post. So, but that's all I wanted to say about that. You would want to update your DP filter and your DP kit because there's been updates that make this better. Um, and that's pretty much it. I'm gonna show the modeling, but I'm gonna run through it pretty fast. I will show you the objects beforehand, but I'm going to play it back pretty fast, but I'll narrate it as best I can. But I wanted to leave it in there just so it was a complete tutorial. And also, one other thing, this is how my color space is set up. But you don't have to have it that way, but you're going to have to compensate for it if it's differently. So it's just something to be aware of. I like dealing with all my stuff per color and per texture. I'll just do it in the surface editor or in the node editor. But if you're using the color space here, you're going to want to make sure you either compensate for it or have it set up like this. So, alright, let's just get started. So here's what we got in Modeler. I just have this logo here, and it's got a bevel on it, you'll see. Slight bevel. And then I got one that's just a low-res version of that. And then we have here, which is this is the cutter object we're going to use. Well, it's actually a template for the cutter. That's what we're going to use to cut the logo out with. And then here's the actual cutter object. It's just easier to do the deformations on a single-sided poly like this and then transfer it over afterward. So that's why I'm setting it up like this. And then here we got this. I needed a weight map that followed the contour of the Lightwave logo. So that's why we have this. And then on this one we got an instance, just a single little ball there. It's what we're using for a particle. So the first thing we want to do is load that EPS file, the logo, and we're going to center it and scale it up by 10 times. And now I'm just cleaning up these points here so when I bevel it, it's as clean as possible. Because the way the bevel works, and I still have to clean it up anyway, but not as bad if I didn't do this. So I just delete these points we don't need, try and clean it up. So then I extrude that 500 millimeters, and I copy it and put it in the next layer. And then back on the first layer, I bevel those faces by 50 millimeters. And then I knife it across the top at 50 millimeters. So that gives me this little. And now I fix these where the Lightwave's bevel poops itself. I'm fixing these up. There's a few of them where it was real sharp. It wasn't that bad. It kind of sucks that you have to even do that. So that's that. Then what I do is I select all those inner edges there. And I just select loop. I select one of each and then I hit select loop. Then I use rounder. So that gives me a nice bevel on there. and I just named the surface logo, and then I go to the other one and name that logo low. And now I triple these because DP Boolean, you need it to be tripled. It works best. So now I want to deal with that cutter template, so I'm just going to drag out a grid. And I'm just going to give it equal segments. And then I'm just going to select and roughly the shape of the Lightwave logo. And you don't want to go to the farthest, you don't want to select the outside edge, because that's important. You'll see why in a second. So basically what we're trying to do here is we just want to have this more dense where we need it and not dense at all where we don't. So we're just going to divide this and then contract the selection and then divide it some more and then contract it until we get down to the resolution that we want. So if I Shift D, I think it is. So Shift D and then contract it, Shift D and then contract it again, Shift D. And that's about the density that I wanted. So now I'm just going to shrink it down so that it's as small as I can get it. I just want it to be as dense as possible with the polys that I have. So I'm just shrinking it so it fits right around it. Just so it all fits in there without any of the logo sticking out anywhere. So that should be good. So now I'm just going to triple that. Give it a surface. We'll call it cutter template. And I'm just going to copy that and put it in another layer. And then I'm going to extrude this 100 millimeters, negative on the Z. It takes a minute to calculate that. And then we just want to take them polys on the back side and we're just going to merge them all. And then we're going to clear those unused points, and then we're just going to triple those new polys there. So that gives us that. We'll name that cutter, surface. So now we're going to create that object for the weight map. And I'm just dragging out a spline here, just fitting pretty closely to the object. And this is where you got to be creative, because each animation you're going to want to do something different with. Like this is in the shape of a logo, the spiral's in the shape of a logo, so that's why it works out nice to do it this way. But if you have a different logo with a different type of shape, you're going to want to. This is going to have to be something you do on a per object basis that goes with the shape that you're using. So I just rail extruded a point. So I have evenly spaced points, and now I'm going to create a curve out of that. Now I just adjust it one last time to make sure it's not overlapping anywhere. Now I copy that, put in a new layer. Now I'm just going to do the other side. But like I was saying, this is where you're going to have to kind of be creative, because each object's different, and you're going to want to reveal it differently. But you can usually, it'll be something similar to doing it. It'll just be a weight map in a different direction, or maybe if it's in a letter, you do it in the shape of the letter. But that's where you can get creative for different objects. But just want to keep these. You can see I'm just trying to make it so that they're evenly spaced. Now I'm just making sure they're nice and close. Now, one thing I do want to say, I'm going to be using paint weights in layout for some of this. But if you don't have that plugin, you're going to want to make this mesh density on this object here a little bit higher. You want it to be at least as dense as that other object that I created. And you'll see why, because it'll make it go smoother if you don't have paint weights, if you make the mesh density on this a little higher. So I'm just going to create a 2-point poly between those 2 points. I'm going to extrude a 1-point polygon, and I'm going to extrude it, I don't know, 35 times, but if you don't have weight paints, you're going to want to do it maybe twice that amount. Now I'm just going to take that 2-point poly, I'm going to make a texture map for it. And you can see, you'll see it in the top left corner. And now I'm going to take that 2-point poly and I'm just going to rail extrude it across these rails, the 2 splines there. And that gives me that. And you can see the UV map at the top. I'm going to make that a little more dense. But like I was saying, if you don't have paint weights and layout, you're going to want to make that about twice as dense as that. And you'll see why later. But so now I'm just going to convert them UVs to a weight map. And you can see UV to weight. And that gives me that weight map there. So that's all we got for that object. I'm going to make sure it's on the Z. So then the only other object we got to deal with is the instance, and that's just a tessellated sphere. So we'll name that logo weight, template, surface. Now I'm going to create the sphere. Let's create a ball, a tessellated sphere with 1 segments, and we'll do it at 50 millimeters. And that's pretty much all there is. And then we'll name it instance. I will name all these layers, that's right. Just so they're easy to know what's what in layout. And I also unify polys with this one object. You'll see the one with that I extruded that 2-point poly chain. It puts polys on both sides. So if you just go to unify polys, it'll delete half of them. It really didn't matter, but there's no need to have all those extra polys in there. Okay, so now what we're going to do is deal with the deformations for that cutter object. So I'm just going to load the low-res logo, and I'm going to load the cutter template. And I'm just going to set up the viewport real quick, get this light out of the way. I'm going to turn it off because I don't use it at all. And I'm just going to move it out of the way. And I'm going to select that low-res logo object. I'm just going to turn it on invisible for now, hidden. And I'm also going to move it -1 on the Z, because that'll push it into my object here, that deformation object. And that's important for using the Boolean node. So I'm just going to go into deformations for that cutter object. I'm going to add DP Boolean. And I'm going to select the logo. I'm just going to plug in the delta. And that'll give me this effect. So now what I want to do is I'm just going to get Tools Boolean, or blur tool, I'm sorry. And I want to set it on 4x4 at 70 millimeters in world coordinates. And this will be a little bit slow, but it won't be too bad. And it'll just blur that. It's supposed to be the delta hooked up, but I have the distance, so I'll switch that now. and you'll see it'll give me this, but I want to clean that up a little bit more than that even. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy that blur node. Now keep in mind, when I plugged this in, it took over 5 minutes to calculate on my system, but we're just going to save out a morph anyway, so it really didn't matter. But just be warned, once you plug this in with these two blur nodes hooked together, it's going to take a long time. So on that second blur, I just took it down to 10 millimeters, and I'm going to turn it on so it's only a 2x2 matrix. And I'm going to plug that into the other blur. And then I'm just going to invert that. I'm going to vector scale it by negative 225% because I want my displacement to go in the other direction for the animation that I'm doing. So now when I plug this in, like I said, it took 5 minutes, over 5 minutes on my system. But you end up with this. So the first thing you want to do is just save out a morph of that. Save endomorph. We'll call it logo imprint. And then what we want to do, we just unhook that. I'm going to save the object because that'll save the morphs as well. Just move them out of the way for now. So now you can see if we get the vertex map, morph map, select our morph, and we get the same exact effect. So I'm just putting it on double-sided, and I'm turning the smoothing up pretty high. And that gives us that. So the next thing we want to deal with is bringing that weight map in. So I'm going to load that weight template object. And you'll see when I put it in wireframe. So there's the object. Now, like I said, there's two ways you can go about doing this. If you don't have paint weights, then you're going to have to go about doing it this way. You just want to get nearest point, and we're going to select the weight template on both of them for the point info and the nearest point there. And we're going to plug in the weight from our nearest point. So basically what we're doing, this is just sucking the weight from those points on that other object. It's getting the closest points on the other object and then getting the weight map from them. And then we're using it to displace us. And that'll work fine if you do it this way, but like I said in the previous section, you're going to want to make sure that you have a denser mesh than I made for the weights template. You want that to be denser. But being that I'm going to use paint weights, I could just blur the weight map, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go into that object. I'm going to go to paint weights, and then I'm just going to go to transfer weight map, and I'm going to select that weight template and hit transfer, and you can see it'll just suck the weights from it. And now I'm just going to smooth them by 10% with 4 iterations. And that's not even necessary, but it is because I didn't use a high enough resolution template. So, like I said, if you use a higher resolution template, you can not even have to use that smoothing at all. And I'm demonstrating why here. You'll see in a second. So here's what you get after I use the paint weights with the smoothing. And then here's what you get with just the template. And that's because the resolution of the template is lower than the resolution of that mesh that we're trying to displace. So you would just have to make your resolution of your template probably twice as dense. But we don't need to worry about it. So because I'm going to use this weight map. So we can get rid of that object. We don't need it anymore. And we can get rid of those 2 nodes because we don't need them. So, alright, now we're going to set up the animation for this. So, what we're going to do, we're going to use a gradient here. And we're just going to cycle through this weight map basically with 2 different values. We're going to add it to this morph map. So we're going to get a gradient, and we're going to feed that weight map into it. That should be in the input. I messed up there, but I'll go back and fix it. So I'm just creating two keys and showing the output. And then I'm going to add a null here. This is what we're going to use the control. Oh no, what I'm doing here is I'm just showing that logo layer so that we can see it. It's important that we can see that while we're setting up the animation. I know I am adding I'm adding the null. I'm sorry. So we're going to use that null to control this spiral animation. So I'm just going to get item info. I'm going to get that control. I'm going to get a vector scalar, 2 of them on the X. And we're going to go from the position in the one and the scaling into the other. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the position to control the position of the keys, and then the scale will be like the size of the gradient, basically. So I can use the scale to change the fall off. So I'm just going from the position into the position 1, and then the position plus the scale into the position key 2. And then I'm just plugging these into the alpha for the 2 values. So now I'll plug that into the input like it should have been. So now you'll be able to see when I drag through this with the, you can see it's cycling through that weight map with those 2 values that I've plugged into it. So now I'm showing that logo layer so we can see it. And it's giving me a weird OpenGL error there. If I would have messed with the smoothing, it would have went away, but I'm going to replace this object with the actual high res, the one with the bevel in it. So it really doesn't matter. So if I just replace with object layer with logo, so there's our logo with the bevel on it. So now you can see when we cycle through this, it's kind of giving us, there's a little more we have to do, but you can get the idea of what's happening here. So one thing I do is I change the scale here. So I'm going to, if I change the scale on the X of that null object, it'll just shorten the gradient for our fall off. The keys will be on 0.5 apart instead of 1. So what I'm doing here is I'm just adding some texture displacement in world coordinates. And so, because then we'll be like, we'll move through this texture with our other displacement. Just turn the scale up to 2.25 meters. Texture amplitude to 0.6. So now when we do this other displacement here in our nodes, it'll be moving through that other world displacement texture. It adds a little bit of more realism to it. So now I'm just adjusting that bottom key so that I'm completely on the outside of that logo. And now I'm going to go around the other side and make sure that make sure the other side is just on the other side of it. So we'll adjust that top key till we're just covering it. So that's pretty much it for the deformation animation. I do switch it over to a curve node because it's a little bit softer. I can get the fall off on the keys. You'll see in a second. This actually would have been fine just like this as well, but I do switch it over to a curve node. Just making sure this looks right. I think I shorten that gradient, or I shorten the scale again. I go from 0.5 to 0.45 just to shorten it up a little bit. I probably would have went even smaller than that if I was doing it over, but it's fine the way it is. Now I'm animating it from 0 to 300, so that's 10 seconds worth. Because I'm at 30 frames a second. So I just animated that null so that over 10 seconds it completely covers the logo. So that's pretty much the animation for the deformation. Now I just switched this over to a curve node. Like I said, it's not really necessary, but it does make the fall off a little bit smoother. I could have done it with the gradient, but it would have had to have added more keys to it, and I just think this was easier to deal with it this way. So I'm just going to get a curve node and unplug the weight map in. And for the first key, I just want to get the key for the amount for that first key there and paste it into this one. And I'm going to create another key, and I'm going to get the amount for the second key, paste it into that one. See, now I got that nice fall off for them keys. I could have done that with the gradient, but it would have been more work. So I'm just going to copy those couple nodes that I used to control the position of the keys, and I'm just going to go into the the envelope for that first key, and I'll put a motion modifier on it, node channel filter. I picked the wrong thing, that's why that popped up. Node channel filter, paste them in. I don't need them bottom two for this key. And then for the second key, do the same thing, node channel filter. So it's basically doing the same thing as the gradient was, but now I have the fall off for these keys. It makes it a little, you'll be able to see what it does. I didn't plug it in yet, so you're still seeing it the way it was. So if you look at the logo when I plug this in, you'll see it change. It's just a little less harsh. So that's pretty much the animation for the cutter object. And then what we got to do here is we have to save out two MDDs. But what we first have to do is we have to transfer the motion from that onto our actual cutter object, because remember, this is just a template. So I'm going to load that other layer, and it's cutter. And if you remember, those points in that one side are right on top of each other when there's no deformation happening. So what we can do is we can use nearest point in object space and just lock these points together, which is what we're going to do. So if I go to the actual cutter object and I go into the deformations, and I'm going to get DP kit item info nearest point, and I'm going to get AS tools logic vector. I'm going to get a vector subtract. So what I want to say is I want to get the distance. Well, first thing we're going to do, we have to make sure that's on. Make sure we turn off world coordinates, and we want to select our cutter template, and we want to get the distance, and we want to say if the distance is 0, then we input that, and that locks it all together. So now wherever that template object goes, this other object will follow, because those points were on top of one another in object space before there was any deformations happening. So we're just saying if the points are on top of each other, do this deformation. That's what that node network's saying. So now what I'm doing here is I'm going to save that out, the MDD, to intro MDD, and I let it save out there. Then I'm going to remove that, Now what we have to do, because we want to do this in reverse, what I also have to do here is I have to save out another MDD here, but we have to do it with the with that weight map inverted. So if we get a mass scalar invert, and then if we just invert that weight map, go into the input, so then that'll give us this. So now we need to save out that MDT2. Because remember, we need this to play. We need it to appear and then disappear. So I'm just going to bake out that MDD. I'll call that outro. And they're actually reversed because originally it was going to play in the other direction. Okay, so what we're going to do here is set up the Boolean for the outro and deal with some scene settings. So I'm just going to save this scene as version 3. And it actually ends up being the intro because I ended up switching it afterward. But so I just deleted that object, the template cutter object, and now I'm moving that logo back to 0 because it was on -0.1 UMs. Now I'm going to the cutter and I'm going to get that MDD that we just saved out. I'm going to get outro, which ends up being the intro, but it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to turn it on 20%, so that's going to lengthen our animation by 5 times. So I changed my end frame to 1700. And I'll tell you why I'm doing that when I get to the particles. It's important for creating as many particles as we need without any stepping, but I'll get to that later. So I just changed the surfacing for my cutter to double side and 135 smoothing. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn out the wireframe. Now I believe what I do is set up some of these camera settings. First I do the Booleans. So I'm going to get DP kit. I'm in the cutter service. Get DP kit Boolean. I'm going to select the logo outside, plug it into the clip map, and I'm going to go into the logo, get DP Boolean, set it to the cutter surface, leave it on inside, go to alpha into the clip map. So that takes care of our Boolean. So now I deal with the camera. So because I'm using particles, and I use motion blur passes here. So I'm just putting on, and I'm using open image denoiser, so that's why I'm using box reconstruction filter. So I'm just doing, and I also changed my blur length to 500% because remember, I slowed down my animation, so I got to lengthen my blur length. So I'm just turning off all these settings because I don't need any ray tracing for this. Ray recursion to 2, turn on GI, leave important sampling on. Going to do 2 bounces with 2 samples. And I'm just going to set my camera up a little bit. So I just create a ground plane here, 60 meters. And then I'm going to rotate that -90. Now I'm just going to back that up behind the logo. So now I'll hide that so we don't have to see it. So I'm just going to turn that to darker color, the ground plane. And I'll turn the logo and the cutter on that orange color. So I'm deleting that control null. We don't need that anymore. Now I'm going to go and add a backdrop, texture environment, spherical on the Y, and I'm going to load it's just a HDR I have. It's a studio light. It's got a harsh light to it though. So I'm going to rotate it -45 on the. So we'll see what the Booleans look like. So I just go through it to make sure it's working properly. Seems to be good. I think I changed the lighting a bit. Probably could have added some of this out. I'm pretty sure I do added the light at some point. Yeah. So I just changed it so it's a little more harsh. So right there. So the next thing we do, I think I deal with the surface editor for the cutter, because we want the cutter to be a different color based on how deep into the object it is. It gives it makes it look like it has depth to it, like that it's not all one solid color. So if I go into the cutter and I just plug that distance into a gradient, so that'll just give me the distance from the surface of the logo object. And if I use that orange color and then I go to white, I mean, you could do any color. This is just what I chose to do with this. And then if I plug that into the color, now it's not going to be a linear gradient like I want it to be, and that's because of the way my color space is set up. So you'll notice it's kind of like it's not a linear gradient like it should be. So what I can do to fix that is I just get a DB&W color, I think it's color space, yeah. And if I just go from RGB to linear and then plug the distance in that, it'll give me a linear gradient. So that's all I wanted to show with that. So that gives us that depth to it, so we know how far from the surface we are. So now all I'm doing is I'm adding a pixel filter, DP pixel filter, because what I need here is a normal pass. So I'm just selecting the normal, selecting multi-threaded AA. I'm going to get a render buffer, and I'm just going to plug the normal pass into this global buffer 1, and that will give me an AA normal pass. And then what I'm doing here is I'm just outputting the RGBA, the final RGBA, and then I'm going to add DPKit image filter. And what I'm going to do here is I'm enabling the raw RGB, and I'm going to get the global buffer that I just made, and then the render buffer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Open Image Denoiser. So we'll go to get Open Image Denoiser, turn on HDR. So if we take the raw color into the albedo and the color into the color, and then the normal into the normal. So that sets up the open image denoiser, and that saved me a lot of render time. I got these down to like a minute per frame, I think, and it was taking much longer to clean up the noise without it. So that's why I ended up doing it that way. You should be able to see here a difference. Yeah, you will be able to. I think I do a test render. So you can see the difference between the denoised version and the non-denoised version. It definitely makes a big difference. So that was just setting up the open image denoiser. I think that's pretty much all I show. That's all there is for that part of it. The next part we deal with the particles. But like I said, I do this in two separate scenes because I wasn't sure which direction I wanted to play this back at. So I'm just darkening or lightening up that floor. And I'm turning the diffuse down to 75 for the cutter and the logo. So that's it. The next part we'll deal with the particles. Okay, so what we got to do with the particles is we got to switch out those. We'll save the scene as a new version, version 4. And then we'll switch out that MDD to the other MDD because we needed to go in the other direction. So that's it for that. Now, like I said, this is the reason that we slowed this down by 10 times, well actually 5 times, is because we need to be able to emit as many particles as we can without any stepping. And in order to do that in Lightwave, you got to extend your timeline by more than what you, especially if you have fast emitting particles. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a particle emitter to our cutter object. And I'm just going to adjust the settings a little bit. I'm going to make the lifetime. These all change over the course of me testing this. So you can just see what I'm putting in here. 400 and I do 100. And then I change the plus and minus for the resistance and the speed to 0.2. Turn parent motion off. Just making all these, changing all these settings. Change it to 1,000 to start with, 1,000 per frame. Now I'm going into the procedural texture for the birth rate, and I'm going to get node texture. I'm going to put it on 1, world coordinates. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get DP Boolean, and I'm going to get the logo. I'm going to get the alpha into the scaler. And you can see that gives me the logo. Now what I'm going to do is remap that. That's important to remap this. So the bottom key I want to make at negative 0.01%. Needs to be below 0 or you may get a few stray particles. And for the top one I just leave it 1. So now what I'm doing here is I'm just going to create a wind just so we can get this to see what way these particles are going. And the way I do this wind is I use, you'll see in a second, it's a directional wind. Just turn the power to 100. The radius doesn't matter because I turned the fall off. It's a directional wind. Put it on heavy wind because I don't want the weight to have any effect on this wind. And I just zeroed everything out. I'm going to go into the texture here. And I'm going to get procedural texture, node texture. Turn it to 100%. Put it on world coordinates. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a spot info. And I'm going to get a DP kit, or I forget what I get first. Math, vector, subtract. And then I get a DP kit, item info. And I put that on the wind object. And what I do is I'm just going to get the vector between the world spot and the world position of the wind and put that in. Now that pretty much gives me like what the explosion wind does, but what I want to do is I want to normalize that so that it's just giving me a one constant speed no matter what. It's not going to accelerate the further I get away from the wind. Now I'm just backing that wind up so that it's shooting these particles in the direction that I want it to. And then as it gets closer to the center, I'll move the wind closer to the object. So now we'll be able to see what our particles are doing at least. So I'm going to calculate that. And you can see it's all wrong. And that's because that gradient is backwards. And so is the wind. So if I go into my wind, and I'm just going to change which way I'm subtracting these. And that'll force the wind into the other direction. And what I also need to do is fix the gradient for my particle emitter because it's in the wrong direction. So if I go into the texture for the birth rate and just invert the keys on this gradient, that'll fix our issue. So now it'll only emit from that mesh where the Boolean's happening. And you'll be able to see that here. I stopped it short just so you can see what's happening here. So only where that Boolean's happening on that mesh do we get the particles being born. And like I was saying, the reason that I lengthened this timeline to 1700 and slowed the animation down is because in order to get enough particles here, you have to slow the animation down big time. Where you start to get stepping in the particles, especially if you want to have fast moving particles. So I'm just turning this start frame to 55 so I don't have to deal with calculating them for first frames for no reason. So I think I do another quick test here. So we get that. Now what I do is I add a second wind in here because it definitely adds to it a bit of a flow noise. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I just saved that motion out just so it's not trying to calculate. While I'm messing around, and I can look at it and look at the timing. And what I end up doing here is I only render every 10th frame, so it actually is 10 times faster than my animation is. So that's the way this is all working out, is that I only end up rendering every 10th frame. And that makes the animation 10 times faster, but it gives me all the particles that I need at the speed that I want them. And the only reason I did it with the other scene was just to keep the scenes the same, because it makes it easier when doing the compositing if both scenes are the same. So now I'm just adjusting these settings a little bit. And here I'm adding another wind here. And it's another directional wind. and this one I put on add. Turn the fall off. And then I'm just going to add a flow noise here. Turn the scale up a bit. Turn the octaves down. Put it in world coordinates. Just looking over these settings real quick. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just messing around. Oh, I think it was because I couldn't see the actual... Usually you can see the noise on the wind and I couldn't see it. But it's only because my objects are so big, and that's what I was trying to find out, why I couldn't see the noise on that wind. So I'm just doing a quick test render here, or test calculation of these particles. So I think I make one more adjustment here. I play with it a bit, but I come back and show you the settings when I'm done. I change all the settings, but I show you afterwards. So here's the final one. I go through each setting and show you what I did different. So I up the particle from 1,000 to 10,000. So it gives me 10 times more particles. And I changed the lifetime to 275. Now you can leave these particles live forever. I chose to let them die. I turned the power of Wind 1 up to 125. And for Wind 2, I turned the power up to 70%. And I also turned the size up a bit, and I also animated the position on the Z and then the rotation very slightly over time, just so it gives a little more organic feel to it. So that's the particle simulation we're going to go with for this effect. So I think I just saved this out. So I'm going to save scene as, save it as the next version. So now I'm going to load that instance object, I believe. I removed the particle emitter and I turned those winds off because we don't need them. Then I'm going to load that instance, load object layer, get our instance, and I'm going to add the emitter to this object because it makes hiding the instance a bit easier with DP instance if you can get away with doing this. So I'm just going to load that particle that I saved out, the PFX. I'm going to add instances to this, DP instancer. I'm going to put it on none, passes to 1. I'm going to select the instance object, add it, put it on grouped, And now I'm just trying to figure out the max number of instances I need here. It ends up being 200,000, I think. 200,000 particles are on the screen at one time. Okay. So then what else do we do here? I think I adjust the size of those instances. Yeah, because you can see they're way too big. But everything's working as expected, so that's good. So if we go into the scaling for our instances here, and I'm just going to turn the minimum size to 50, I end up changing this again. And this should also be on mode, should be set to size as well. I'll get to that later. So that just shrinks down those instances a little more. Looks a little more like particles. Once you get motion blur, it looks even better. So now, I think I deal with that instance in the center maybe. That's the actual object that we're instancing. If I go into the scene editor and just click that check mark next to the instance, that'll disappear. So that got rid of the object. So now, what do we do next? Let's see. Okay, I think I deal with color in the instances. So if we go into our instance surface, I copy this out of this network, out of the color, and I paste it into the instance. And we got to do something a little different here than using the Boolean. The Boolean will work. You could use the Boolean here if you were doing this in the hypervoxels, but being that we're in the service editor, we're going to have to do it a little different. I'm going to get the particle info, and I'm going to set it to nearest, and I'm going to select our particle layer, and I'm going to get a DP filter, replace spot. And what I'm going to do is we're going to color these based on the start position of these particles. So we're going to replace the spot with the world position of the star position. And what we're going to do is like I said, if we were doing this in hypervoxels, you'd be able to use the distance right from that Boolean. But since we're not, what we have to do is get ray intersect, DPK ray intersect, and we want to use the ray source for our ray direction. And we want to select our logo. And we want to get the distance from that, and that will allow us to shade our particles, our instances, based on the start position of the particle. So now if we go into the color here, so basically it'll just match up, the instance color will match up with the surface color that it got emitted from, is what ends up happening. I'm just messing with the lighting here. I end up changing all this before the end, but I'm just trying to see how this all looks. Just making sure everything's working right. Okay, so I'm going to make them instances even smaller. I think I can end up doing 30 to 70 or something, or 30 to 60%. So that just made them a little bit smaller. I want them to look like particles. And once you put motion blur on it, it looks even better. So I'm just saving that. That's pretty much it. I might do a quick test render. And you can see the denoiser really cleans it up really nice. I was surprised at how well the denoiser worked. I think I turned that ambient down. I usually don't like using the ambient light, but if I'm using GI, I don't mind using a little bit of it because I feel like it can add to the, especially if it's very directional GI. So I turn the ambient down to 5. And I think I changed the scale on these. I go from 40 to 60%. There's a few more things I want to do to these particles, or the instances that I didn't do in the original. And if I re-render this out, I want to have it done in this one because I think it will make it a little bit better. And one of the things is to, as it is now, the instances just pop off when they get to the end of the lifetime. But what I want to do is I want to get these to fade out over basically from the time they're 75% old to 100% old. I want them to fade out their transparency from 0% transparent to 100% transparent. And we can do that. I didn't do it in the original because I didn't think about it, but I'm going to do it in this version because if I render this, I want it to be like that. I think what I'm doing here is I'm just fixing that scaling. This should be set to size. And I'm going to go into the surface editor. First we got to deal with, because I want the shadows to work properly with this transparency, what I have to do is we got to turn on ray trace transparency. And you got to turn the ray recursion up a bit. This will add to the rendering time, but not too bad. It's renderable. Especially with and you got to turn on directional rays and use transparency in the global illuminations. And then that'll allow the GI shadows to cast properly with the transparency. So now I'm just going to set up the transparency. But first I turn the diffuse to 75% for the cutter, the logo, and the instances. But now I'm going to set up the transparency for those. So I'm just going to use the relative particle age. So that goes from 0 to 1. So I'm just going to use the alpha. And I'm just making this drastic so I can see what's happening in the viewport, and then I'll adjust it once I know how this is affecting everything. And you'll see nothing's happening because it's not plugged in, but I didn't realize that it wasn't plugged in. So I'm just making sure these are all set properly still, and they are. So if I plug the alpha into the transparency, and you'll see it's reversed now. It's killing the as they're just born. So I'm just going to invert them keys. So now it's killing the end ones. And I'm going to spread that gradient out. Go from 0.75 to 1. So that's just going to fade the transparency from 0.75 to 1 on the relative particle age. And now I think I add a procedural to the ground plane just to break it up a bit. Make it 10 meters. I add a gradient over that. And I'm just going to use two pretty dark colors. So that gives me that. And that just breaks up the background a little bit. And it'll also help prevent banding when YouTube compresses it. Especially if you're going to have a vignetting, which I'm going to have. So it's better if it's just not a perfect radial gradient. So breaking up that backdrop will help it compress a little bit nicer too. So I'm just doing a quick test render. I think that's pretty good. Now I'm going to darken up that 1K. I want it to be a little bit darker. Okay, so now what I'm doing here is I'm going to set up my files that I'm going to export these out and use them for compositing. So I'm just using the render buffer here, and I'm going to save out the RGB and the raw RGB. And I'm just going to save the files on F10. Just creating some folders here for these two separate scenes. So that's good there. And then what I want to do is I'm going to go into the node image filter, and I'm not going to use the, I'll do that when I composite the images with the denoiser. But I do want to save out that normal buffer. So I just want to save the file here, open EXR. So we're just going to save it into that intro file. We'll just call it normal AA. And one thing is that save buffer 1 RGB should obviously be checked, which I didn't do, but that should be checked or it's not going to save, obviously. So make sure you check that save buffer 1 RGB. And I'm just making sure this is set up right. So it's just going to output 3 passes. The noisy RGBA, the raw RGB, and then the anti-alias normals. And I need those 3 passes for each one of these scenes. And then I'm setting up my render globals here. So I'm going to go from 0 to 1700, and I'm going to render it by 10 every 10 frames. So that's going to make this basically 5-second animations. It'll be 6-second animations. on the way in and on the way out. And like I said, the reason you got to lengthen them like that is because you want to be able to birth enough particles without any stepping. That's why I lengthen them like that. So I'm just rendering. Do a test render of this. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to load that camera from the other scene just to make sure they match up. So this is the other scene, that first one that I set up. That's just the Boolean without the particles. So that's the scene that I'm in right here, and I loaded the camera from the particle scene. So now I know that I have matching cameras because that's important for this to work properly. Those cameras need to be locked off in the same position. So now I'm just making sure the settings are right for this other scene. They're the same, minus the transparency because I don't need that for this version. I only needed that for the particles. So I turn all the transparency stuff off. And I'm setting up the render globals 0 to 1700 by 10. And I got to do the same thing here with the buffers for this scene as well. So basically what it's going to spit out are, I'm going to have two image sequences that go from 0 to 1700 each, but every 10th frame. And then I got to composite that together into one animation. And the reason I did it that way is because I didn't know which way I was going to want to play this back when I was making it. I figured it was just easier to just do it like this. So I'm just doing the same thing. I'm getting the overall RGB and the RGBA from the render buffer. And then in the node image pixel filter, I'm going to get that. And don't forget to check this save extra buffer, which I didn't do there either. So I just save out that file. So that it basically gives us three passes for each scene. Now I'm checking out, making sure everything's set right on the surfaces. Quick test render. And that's without the denoising because I took it off. That's the actual RGBA. So that's pretty much it for both scenes. That's all both animations set up to render in both scenes. So now what we got to do here, so I just opened up a new scene here, and I'm just going to add them to the render queue. So I'm going to add both scenes, logo intro, logo outro, and then we can render them off. Now I'm not going to actually render these, but I'm going to use the ones that I already rendered from when I did the animation originally to do the end of this tutorial, but it's the same thing. So now what I'm doing here is I'm going to turn all that anti-aliasing off for this camera. I don't want any AA. I want it to be regular box filtering. And then I'm setting up the render globals from 0 to 3400 by 10. So this will be the composition. This will be the scene I used to comp all these animations. So I'm going to turn all these options off. Probably don't have to worry about that because the post-processing is after the render, but it's still there's no sense in having all this turned on. It's not going to get used. So that's what we're going to get if we render nothing. So now I'm going to load them images in. So I'm going to load the outro first, or the intro first. I forget which one. So I'll just get the normal. Set it on sequence. We got to change the start and end frame. I don't know why it comes in like that, but it doesn't. Just got to change it and make sure it's right. And then we got to load the raw RGB. Turn it to sequence. It's the same thing basically for all these. Make sure the start and end frame are right. Get the normal or the RGB. Turn it to sequence. So now to render out this complete animation, what we're going to do is we're going to get the pixel filter node editor, or image filter node editor, I'm sorry. Add image filter, node image filter. And we're just going to get 3 image map DP kit. I think it's DP kit tools image map, shaders image map. We're going to select the image, and we need to use his because you can control the frame count on his version. So I just got the RGBA, and now I just got the open image denoiser, and I set that to HDR and linear. So now I'm just hooking in the RGBA into the color and the raw RGB into the albedo. And now we need the normal. And then go into the normal with the normal. So that'll give us our denoised image. Which seems to be working good. Now keep in mind, these are the original, this is the original render I did. This isn't the one that I set up in the tutorial, just because I didn't render that out. I'm probably going to, but I didn't do it yet. So I'm just using the files from the original, but it's the same thing. So now what I'm doing here is I want to play that animation needs to play back in reverse. So I'm just creating an envelope here for this scaler here. And what I'm going to do is on frame 0, I want it to be at 1700, and at frame 1700, I want it to be at 0. So what that's going to do, if I plug that into the frame for all 3 of these, you'll see what that does. It causes the play in reverse, basically, which is what I need. And like I said, the reason I'm doing it like this is because I wasn't sure from the start how I wanted this to play out, which direction. So that's why I did it with 2 separate scenes. But you can see now it's playing in the right direction. It grows in like that, and then it'll disappear with the particles. So basically this one just had to play in reverse. So now I'm loading the other images, the intro. Get the normal. Fix the frames. It's the same as before. Get the raw RGB. Fix the frames, and then one more, get the RGBA. Fix the frames again. I don't know why that they didn't come in right. I would thought they would have, but they didn't. So now we could just clone them 3 and then switch them over. So that would be the raw RGB and then the normal. So now what we have to do is we have to these need to be shifted by 1700 frames. So we want this to go from 0 to 1700, but from, you'll see over here what we do. But from 0, we want it to start at 1700 and play till 3400. So we just need to, they need to play in the right order, but it needs to be shifted by 1700 frames basically. And then we have to move them over. So this one will start when the other one ends. And then what else we have to do is we need to get 3 mixers here. And then we need to switch on frame 1700 from one version to the other. So it's just going to allow us to go from showing the one set of image sequences to the other set of image sequences, and then feed them that into this denoiser. But the reason I wanted to show this is because I think it's very nice to be able to take these image sequences and play them back in whatever order. It's nice to have an image node that does that. I've used that a lot in the past, being able to change the speed and the timing of the playback. So now I'm just creating a scaler that steps down at 1700 from 0 to 1. So it's just going to switch on frame 1700 from playing one to playing the other. And it's reversed here, as you'll see in a second. I gotta go flip them. Because you can see it's the same on both sides, and that's just because these keys are flipped. So if I just invert these keys, that should give me what I want. And it does, as you can see. So now we got both of these animations playing back in the right direction at the right timing. So I thought that was a good part to show because I like being able to use those image nodes like that. So next thing we're doing is going to go into a bloom node. And in there, I'm going to turn the threshold to 75, put it on high quality. And I'm going to turn the strength to 50%. And then I'm going to get a fast tone map. I'm going to go into that. And I'm going to use Unreal preset. I like that. I think theirs looks good. I'm just doing a quick test. So I'm pretty good with that, actually. And then from there, what I'm going to do, I'm going to get I think I get a camera response, DP kit, DP filter, camera response. And this will basically just let you map the color to actual real world color camera values. So it'll take the lightwave camera and it'll map it to real world RGB values to the real cameras. And you can see it kind of gives a little bit of a bluish tint to it a little bit. And they're all different depending on the camera. So that was, next one I get is vignetting and dispersion. And these you want to go, well, the dispersion you want to go easy on. But the vignetting is up to you how you want to do it. I think I go to 10 on it, I forget. And dispersion I do 2%. And that just distorts it as it gets further away from the center of the image. Kind of gives it like a lens dispersion. So there's what we get. I think I turned the exposure up a little bit. So that's pretty much what I go with for the final shot. It might have been a little different in the one I posted. Now I add grain, and the reason I add grain is because it helps with compression. When you upload it to YouTube, if you don't use grain and you have like a vignette like that, it causes huge artifacts. It even does it with it, but you can, if you add grain, you can get it to not be as bad with the artifacts. I even will add more grain than I have on this. And see, I have to pump through a mixer just because for some reason if I go from the grain directly into the pixel filter node thing, it crashes. I don't know why it does that, but that's the only reason I'm pumping it through that mixer. The mixer's doing nothing there. But like I said, on the version I upload to YouTube, I always even add more grain because otherwise I get horrible artifacts. The banding is really bad. But if you add a little bit of grain to it, it cuts back the banding a lot. So that's pretty much all there is to it, guys. I hope he's got something out of it. It took a little bit longer than I was hoping. I usually don't like them taking this long. But being that I had to do this compositing part, it added a good bit of time to it. But I hope you enjoyed it. And take care, guys.